When we try to define a word, or even just like a single proper name,
Hmm.
we usually expect it to function like a fixed coordinate on a map.
Right, yeah.
Like you type an address into your mental GPS and it takes you to one specific predictable location. I mean, you say a name like Abraham Lincoln and you immediately get, the top hat, the Civil War, Gettysburg Address.
It's an immediate association.
Exactly. You say Mount Everest, you get the tallest peak in the Himalayas.
Right, it's like a cognitive shorthand. I mean, human beings naturally crave that kind of linguistic stability.
Oh, for sure.
We need to know that the labels we attach to the world are going to stay put. Because if the definitions of our core cultural references just, kept shifting all the time, communication would become incredibly inefficient.
Yeah, it would just be chaos. But occasionally, and this is what we're getting into today, you encounter a name that completely defies that stability, like a word that just refuses to be pinned down to a single set of coordinates. And today, we are unpacking one of those shapeshifters. We're doing a deep dive into a stack of sources that, well, on their surface, they seem entirely disconnected from one another.
Completely unrelated.
Right. I mean, we have recent Social Security baby name data. We have an academic analysis of ancient Near Eastern inheritance law. There's a profile documenting this really highly specific religious community in modern Texas.
Yep.
And then, just to round it out, we have Wikipedia entries detailing the production of a massive Hollywood blockbuster and, of all things, the career trajectory of an Indonesian pop rock band.
Which I have to say, it sounds less like a cohesive research pile and more like the results of a randomized search engine glitch.
It really does. It sounds completely random, but there is a singular thread pulling all of this together. The mission of today's deep dive is to really trace the incredibly complex, multifaceted legacy of the name and the underlying concept of Noah.
Oh, yeah.
We are going to look at how this one conceptual anchor has managed to fundamentally shape modern property law, inspire covert scientific theologians, trigger a $160 million culture war, and provide the ultimate blueprint for like a public relations resurrection.
And I think because that journey inherently requires us to navigate through some deeply entrenched theological doctrines, ancient religious texts, and some highly charged modern cultural controversies, we should probably be clear about our methodology today.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Let's put the disclaimer out there right now. Our role here is strictly analytical. We are acting as cartographers.
Right.
We are mapping the terrain of these various sources, examining the arguments, the beliefs, the criticisms presented in the material without planting a flag in any of them. We're not taking sides.
No, not at all.
The goal is just to synthesize the ideas and understand the mechanics of how this name operates across different cultures, just completely impartially.
We are looking at the architecture of the ideas rather than litigating their ultimate truth.
Well said. So let's start with the literal statistical footprint of the name today, because it provides a really fascinating baseline for just how ubiquitous this concept is.
Yeah, the naming data is wild.
It is. Looking at the Social Security Administration data tracking baby names from 2024 through 2025, Noah is just a demographic monolith. It holds the #2 spot for boy births nationwide, with zero fluctuation in its ranking between those years. Like, it is firmly entrenched as a quintessential modern masculine identifier.
Which is where our sources introduce rather profound historical irony.
Yes, I love this part.
Because while modern naming trends treat Noah as the ultimate male default, the boy name, the ancient texts reveal that one of the most structurally disruptive, groundbreaking figures to carry that exact name was actually a woman.
Right. And I was completely unaware of this until I read the source material from the Book of Numbers. I mean, we're talking about a female Noah. And her story requires us to fundamentally rethink how ancient property laws functioned.
It really does. We find her in the narrative of the daughters of Zelophehad. And to understand the gravity of her situation, we really have to establish the socioeconomic reality of the ancient Israelites during their time in the wilderness.
Okay, set the scene for us.
So Zelophehad was part of the generation that left Egypt, but he died in the desert, and he left behind no sons. He only had 5 daughters: Mala, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah.
And I want to pause on the legal implications of that, because in an agrarian tribal society like that, having no male heir wasn't just a matter of, personal sorrow for a family.
Oh, no?
It was a structural catastrophe.
It equated to historical and economic erasure, essentially, because the Israelite legal system, like most ancient Near Eastern cultures, was strictly patrilineal.
Right.
Land was distributed among the tribes and the clans strictly based on male lineage. So if a man died without a son to inherit his portion, his name was basically deleted from the tribal registry. Yeah, and his family's land would just be absorbed by other male relatives, which meant the daughters would be left with absolutely nothing. No economic independence, no property, and no legacy for their father.
But these 5 women, and this is what's so amazing, they look at that legal framework and they simply refuse to accept it. The text describes them organizing what is essentially a massive public protest.
Yeah, it's not a quiet petition.
No, they don't petition quietly behind closed doors. They walk right up to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and they stand before Moses, before the high priest Eleazar, the tribal chieftains, and the entire assembly.
Which was huge.
Yeah, the sources note this was an audience of roughly 2 million people.
The psychological courage required for that act is staggering, if you think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, in a patriarchal society where women had virtually no legal standing to advocate for property, these 5 sisters are stepping into the most sacred, intimidating judicial space imaginable.
And their argument is incredibly sharp, too.
It is. They ask a fundamental question of justice. They say, why should our father's name be erased from his clan simply because he didn't have a son? Give us a possession among our father's relatives.
And the mechanism of what happens next is what I find so compelling, because Moses, who is, the ultimate lawgiver of the society, he doesn't actually have a precedent for
That's
this.
stumped.
Yeah. He doesn't dismiss them, but he also doesn't rule on it himself. He brings their case directly to God.
And the ruling that comes back fundamentally rewrites Israelite inheritance law. It's huge. The divine response is unequivocal. It says, the daughters of Zelophehad speak right.
No.
Yeah, they are granted the right to inherit their father's land, and a totally new statute is created stating that if a man dies without a son, his inheritance shall pass to his daughter.
So on paper, it reads like an ancient Supreme Court decision that just shatters the glass ceiling of property rights. It is an enormous legal victory. But reading through the different perspectives in our sources, I found myself kind of questioning the long-term reality of that victory.
Oh.
Because the source from the Jewish Women's Archive points out that this ruling didn't just exist in a vacuum, it triggered an immediate backlash from the male establishment.
It absolutely did. The structural reality of tribal land ownership eventually collided with this new progressive ruling. Because the male leaders of the Manasseh clan, Zelophehad's extended family, they approached Moses with a very pragmatic economic grievance.
Right.
They pointed out a major flaw in the system.
The marriage loophole.
Precisely. The marriage loophole. They argued that if these daughters, who now hold title to significant tribal land, if they end up marrying men from other Israelite tribes, well, the land goes with the women into their new husbands' tribes.
Because the concept of a man leaving his own tribe to assimilate into his wife's clan, that was completely unfathomable to them.
Oh, it was sociologically impossible at the time. I mean, the clans relied on their specific land allotments for survival, for political power, everything. So if the daughters married out, the Manasseh clan would permanently lose their ancestral territory. So they petitioned for an amendment.
And the amendment they receive, honestly, it feels like a massive caveat. Moses decrees that the daughters can keep the land, but they are now legally restricted in who they can marry.
Right.
They have to marry within their own specific tribal clan to ensure the property never crosses tribal lines. And the sources note that Noah and her sisters did exactly this. They married their cousins. So I have to wonder, and this is where I was kind of stuck, does that restriction effectively neutralize the initial victory? Like, was this a genuine triumph for women's autonomy, or was it just a pragmatic legal patch to maintain male tribal wealth?
Well, that tension is exactly where our sources diverge. They offer 2 very distinct lenses on the exact same ancient event. So if you look at the material from CBE International, which advocates for Christian egalitarianism, they focus heavily on the psychological empowerment of the story.
Okay.
The author of that piece looks at the father, Zelophehad, and she argues that to raise 5 daughters who had the audacity to challenge the highest court in the land, he must have instilled in them a profound sense of self-worth.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, she argues he must have taught them that divine promises apply to them just as much as to men. She actually even coins this term, calling her own supportive father a modern-day Zelophi Bob.
Oh, I saw that. It was a very personalized, almost inspirational reading of the text. It frames the story as this timeless blueprint for fathers empowering their daughters to, claim their space in the world.
Exactly. But then, when you shift to the academic analysis provided by the Jewish Women's Archive, the lens becomes much more critical of the systemic structures at play.
Right.
That source doesn't deny the boldness of the women. Not at all. but it emphasizes that the ultimate resolution was deeply conservative.
How so?
Well, the archives suggest this story functioned, in part, to soothe the anxieties of ancient men who had the misfortune, and I use that term from an androcentric perspective, of having only daughters. It assured those men that their legacy could survive, while simultaneously placing very strict boundaries on the women's bodily autonomy and marriage choices just to protect the patriarchal economic system.
It is so fascinating to see how the gravity of a single historical figure, like a female Noah, can generate such wildly different interpretations millennia later. One source sees her as an icon of empowerment, while the other sees her as a participant in a deeply compromised legal negotiation.
Yeah, it really depends on the lens.
It does.
Yeah.
But I want to pivot from a female Noah securing physical land rights to the original patriarch Noah, who has actually managed to inspire a massive modern movement centered entirely on a spiritual inheritance.
Right. This transition takes us into the theological framework of the Bana Noach, or the Noachide movement, which represents a really highly specific and honestly often overlooked intersection between Judaism and the non-Jewish world.
Yes, the profile we have from Ashish introduces this concept through the personal journey of a man named Jim Long. And the mechanics of his discovery are just incredible to me. It's in the early 1990s. Jim is working as a talk radio host in Dallas.
Okay,
He
yeah.
has a sudden guest cancellation, so he's scrambling to fill airtime, right? And he books a local Texas archaeologist named Vendel Jones.
Right, Vendel Jones.
And Jones is an interesting character in his own right. He's out there searching for biblical artifacts like the Ark of the Covenant, and he's actually often cited as one of the real-life inspirations for Indiana Jones.
Oh, really? That's quite a claim to fame.
Yeah.
But during their conversation, Jim Long discovers something about Vendel Jones that completely alters his own trajectory. He learns that Jones, despite not being Jewish, is an observant Noachide.
Right. And Jim is fascinated by this. I mean, it sends him diving into Torah study, and he eventually adopts this identity himself. But I think to understand what Jim actually committed his life to, we need to unpack the underlying theology. What exactly is the legal and spiritual framework of a Noachide?
Right, so the framework originates in the Talmud, and the core premise is that Judaism does not require non-Jews to convert to Judaism in order to achieve salvation or live a righteous life. Instead, it offers a universal covenant based on the story of Noah. The logic is actually pretty straightforward. After the biblical flood, every human being on earth is theoretically descended from Noah. Therefore, the covenant God made with Noah applies to all of humanity.
So it's essentially a baseline moral code for the entire human race, totally distinct from the specific covenant made later with the Israelites at Mount Sinai.
Exactly. The Talmud identifies these as the 7 laws of Noah.
Yeah.
They are considered the foundational pillars required to maintain a civilized, functioning human society.
Well, let's look at the actual mechanics of these 7 laws, because when I read through the list, the first 6 seem like standard, very recognizable pillars of modern civil law.
Sure.
You have prohibitions against murder, theft, idolatry, cursing God, and sexual immorality, along with a positive obligation to establish a system of courts and justice. That all tracks logically as a blueprint for civilization. But then there is the 7th law, which is a highly specific prohibition against eating a limb torn from a live animal. And in the context of the other 6 massive moral pillars, how does that one fit in? It feels so out of place.
I know it does seem incredibly specific to modern ears, but it requires historical context. In the ancient world, prior to refrigeration, keeping an animal alive while removing parts of it for food was a known practice, because it prevented the meat from spoiling.
Oh my God, that is horrific.
It is horrific, and that is precisely the point. The inclusion of that specific law establishes a fundamental baseline for empathy and the ethical treatment of living creatures.
Ah, I see.
It dictates that human dominance over the animal kingdom, which, was granted to Noah after the flood, that dominance cannot be exercised through cruelty. It is a universal prohibition against unnecessary suffering.
That makes a lot more sense.
And the philosophical implication of these 7 laws, particularly as articulated by the medieval scholar Maimonides, is profound. Maimonides argued that any non-Jew who faithfully observes these 7 laws, specifically because they were commanded by God, achieves a rightful place in the world to come.
Which creates this entirely unique spiritual category. And looking at Jim Long's modern life in Texas, you see how these ancient laws create a very particular day-to-day reality.
Oh, yeah, he's walking a fine line.
He is. He embraces the theology, but it requires a very careful balancing act. Like, for instance, he rests on Shabbat, acknowledging the day of rest, but he still drives his car, which an Orthodox Jew would not do.
Right.
He'll eat a cheeseburger, so he's mixing meat and dairy, but he absolutely will not eat pork or shellfish.
He is intentionally observing the universal laws without adopting the specific ritual obligations that are binding only on Jews.
And he is hyper-vigilant about not blurring that line. The source details how he refuses to wear a kippah in public so he isn't mistakenly identified as a Jewish man. And this really stuck out to me. Even when he puts a mezuzah on his doorpost, which is a common Jewish practice, he mounts it on the inside of the doorframe, facing inward, rather than on the outside facing the street.
That's a very deliberate choice.
Very deliberate. He is carving out a space that honors the Torah without appropriating the specific identity of the Jewish people.
What is particularly compelling about the Noahide movement, though, is that while Jim Long represents its modern, organized manifestation, the sources reveal a hidden history of prominent figures who covertly adhered to this exact theology.
Covert Noachides.
Yes, Sir Isaac Newton is arguably the most famous example. The source explicitly describes him as a closet Noahide.
Wait, Sir Isaac Newton, the physicist, the man who formulated the laws of motion and universal gravitation.
Yes, the very same.
Yeah.
Newton's public legacy is obviously entirely scientific, but his private manuscripts reveal a man deeply immersed in biblical theology.
What?
He taught himself Hebrew. He wrote extensively on Torah concepts. He actually sketched the dimensions of the ancient Jewish temple in Jerusalem.
But what was the mechanism behind that? Like, why was a 17th century English physicist so obsessed with the architecture of the ancient temple?
Because Newton believed that the physical architecture of the temple was a scale model of the cosmos.
Really?
Yeah. He believed the ancient Israelites possessed profound divine knowledge about the structure of the universe, and that by decoding the dimensions of their sacred spaces, he could essentially unlock the mechanics of the natural world. He accepted the Hebrew Bible as ultimate truth, but critically, his writings show he rejected the doctrine of the Trinity and the idea of Jesus as a deity.
Which aligns perfectly with the Noahide prohibition against idolatry, as understood through a strict monotheistic lens. But he never went public with any of this.
He couldn't. To publicly deny the Trinity and challenge the doctrines of the Anglican Church in 17th century England, that would have been social, academic, and potentially literal suicide. He would have been ruined.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So he kept his theological writings completely hidden. We also see this influence in John Selden, who was a highly influential 17th century English jurist. But Selden didn't keep it a secret. He actively used the Talmudic framework of the 7 laws of Noah to formulate his theories on international law.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, he argued that these ancient Noahide principles provided a universal legal baseline for all nations.
Well, this historical context brings up a really crucial question regarding the movement today. Because if this theological framework has existed since the Talmud, and brilliant minds like Newton and Selden were engaging with it hundreds of years ago, why is there a visible, organized Noahide movement happening right now?
Right.
Because Jim Long points out that today there are thousands of practicing Noahides, holding international conferences, building robust online communities. What is the catalyst for this modern resurgence?
According to the source material detailing Jim Long's perspective, it is entirely a matter of historical timing and geopolitical shifts.
Oh.
Long theorizes that a mass Noahide movement was structurally impossible until very recently. He points directly to the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, the subsequent ingathering of Jewish populations, and crucially, the rise of the Baal Teshuvah movement.
And just for context, for our listeners, the Baal Teshuvah movement refers to the phenomenon of secular assimilated Jews deciding to return to Orthodox religious observance, correct?
Correct. It is a mass movement of spiritual return within the Jewish world that gained significant momentum in the latter half of the 20th century. And Long's theory operates on kind of a domino effect.
Okay, how so?
Well, the Noahide framework fundamentally relies on the Jewish people acting as the custodians and teachers of the Torah. If the Jewish world is dispersed, fighting for survival, or highly assimilated, they are not in a position to educate the rest of the world.
Right. So the argument is that as the Jewish community solidifies its own spiritual infrastructure in the modern era, it finally creates the capacity to export this universal Noahide knowledge to the non-Jewish world.
Precisely. long views the growth of the Noahide movement, not as an isolated phenomenon, but as a direct spiritual reaction to the religious strengthening of the Jewish world.
That's a fascinating way to look at it.
It is. He views it through an eschatological lens, meaning he believes that as the world inches closer to a messianic era, more individuals from the nations will naturally be drawn to these 7 universal laws. But that awakening is entirely contingent on the readiness of the Jewish community to actually lead it.
It is a remarkable way to interpret modern geopolitical events, viewing the shifting tides of global religion through the highly specific lens of a covenant made after a biblical flood. But, this quiet, deeply studious reverence for the concept of Noah stands in absolute contrast to what happens when you try to commercialize that reverence.
Oh, absolutely.
Because when modern Hollywood attempts to adapt this ancient, culturally loaded figure into a visual spectacle, the result is an incredibly volatile culture war.
Which brings us to Darren Aronofsky's 2014 cinematic epic, simply titled Noah, starring Russell Crowe.
The sheer scale of this production is staggering. We are looking at a budget estimated between $125 and $160 million.
Huge money.
And this wasn't just, a studio assignment for Aronofsky. The Wikipedia source details how he had been fixated on the story of Noah for most of his life, tracing back to a poem he wrote about it in the 7th grade. He brought an immense level of auteur vision to this.
And an immense level of technical ambition, too.
Exactly. The visual effects process alone is mind-bending. The filmmakers made a deliberate choice not to use real animals for the arc sequences.
Right.
Instead, Industrial Light and Magic spent 14 months in post-production rendering an entirely CGI animal kingdom. But they didn't just digitize standard animals, they slightly tweaked the designs to create an idealized, almost pre-fall version of the Earth-res fauna. It was a monumental technical achievement.
It was. However, the CGI animals were not the source of the ensuing global controversy.
No, not at all.
The friction was entirely rooted in the narrative architecture of the film, because Aronofsky and his co-writer, Ari Handel, made it explicitly clear that they had no interest in reproducing a sanitized, simplistic Sunday school version of the story.
Right.
They wanted to explore the grit, the psychological horror, and the complex theology of an apocalyptic event. To do that, they didn't just rely on the brief account found in Genesis. They aggressively incorporated extra-biblical mythology.
Right, and this is where the film really alienated a large portion of its expected audience.
Yep.
They pulled heavily from Jewish midrash, which is a tradition of rabbinic commentary that fills in the gaps of biblical stories. And most controversially, they utilized the Book of Enoch. And for those who aren't familiar, the Book of Enoch is an ancient apocalyptic text. It is not considered part of the canonical Bible by most Jewish and Christian traditions, though it was highly influential in antiquity. And Aronofsky uses it to introduce these massive chaotic elements into the film, most notably the Watchers.
The Watchers are perhaps the most jarring element for audiences expecting a traditional biblical epic.
Oh, I remember sitting in the theater and being completely thrown when these giant multi-armed rock monsters lumbered onto the screen.
It was bizarre for a lot of people.
Yeah, but they are pulled directly from the Enochian texts. They are depicted as fallen angels who came to Earth to help Adam and Eve, but were punished by the Creator and basically encased in stone. And Aronofsky gets heavyweights like Nick Nolte and Frank Langella to voice them.
It's quite a swing.
It really is. But beyond the fantastical elements, the film also dives deeply into the psychological toll of the event. It portrays Noah not just as a righteous shipbuilder, but as a man suffering from profound survivor's guilt, wrestling with the sheer brutality of watching the rest of humanity drown.
The inclusion of these elements fractured the global audience response, and the fault lines fell almost entirely along religious and cultural boundaries. I mean, to understand the fallout, we have to look first at the censorship the film faced in the Islamic world. The movie was aggressively and preemptively banned in several nations, including Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Indonesia.
And the mechanism behind that censorship isn't just about the film being, edgy. It is rooted in very specific Islamic jurisprudence, correct?
Yes. In Islam, Noah, or Nu, is recognized as a highly venerated prophet and messenger of God. And within mainstream Islamic tradition, there's a strict adherence to endocanism when it comes to holy figures.
Right.
This means there's a theological prohibition against creating visual depictions of the prophets. The rationale is to prevent any form of idolatry and to maintain the absolute reverence of these figures. Major religious institutions, such as Al-Azhar University in Egypt, issued statements condemning the film, arguing the portrayal of the prophet on screen, especially in a gritty, conflicted manner like Aronofsky did, provokes the feelings of believers and violates Islamic law. So the censorship in those regions was absolute.
Meanwhile, the response in the West, particularly among Christian demographics, wasn't censorship, but it was incredibly polarized. It essentially split down the middle between those who prioritize literalism and those who prioritize thematic theology.
Exactly. On one end of the spectrum, you had young Earth creationist organizations taking severe issue with the film. Figures like Ken Ham and Ray Comfort publicly blasted Aronofsky's interpretation.
Oh.
Comfort even went so far as to produce and release his own counter-documentary.
I remember that, yeah.
Their core grievance was that the film was an unbiblical fable that distorted the sacred text. They objected vehemently to the inclusion of the Watchers. They were frustrated that the film seemed to accommodate concepts of evolutionary creation, and they were particularly annoyed that the script constantly referred to God as the creator, rather than using specific biblical names.
But on the flip side of that exact same religious coin, you had prominent leaders offering high praise for the film's willingness to wrestle with the text.
Yeah.
Like the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, he reviewed it favorably, calling it deeply thought-provoking. Rabbi Shmuley Boteach argued it was a valuable, necessary film for our times. They didn't view the extra-biblical elements as a threat. They viewed the film as a modern piece of midrash. They appreciated that Aronofsky was exploring the massive, complex tension between divine justice and divine mercy and, the inherent corruption of human sin.
It really highlighted a fundamental divide in how different groups consume religious media. Some demand strict, literal adherence to the text, while others seek an imaginative exploration of the text's underlying themes.
But we cannot discuss the cultural collision of this movie without addressing the intense casting controversy, which honestly had nothing to do with theology and everything to do with modern Hollywood structures.
Oh, this was a massive point of contention.
It was. The film faced a massive wave of criticism regarding whitewashing. I mean, you have a narrative set in the ancient Middle East, originating from ancient Near Eastern texts, and the principal cast consists of Russell Crowe, Jennifer Connelly, Emma Watson, Anthony Hopkins, and Ray Winstone.
The visual representation was overwhelmingly white, which drew immediate structural critiques from scholars and cultural commentators.
The sources highlight several prominent voices who called this out. Reverend Will Gaffney, who is a professor of Hebrew and womanist scholar, pointed out a stark reality. She said the Bible is arguably the most multicultural piece of literature the average person will ever encounter, yet Hollywood consistently strips that diversity away when putting it on screen.
It's a very fair critique.
It is. Ephraim Smith, a prominent religious leader, accused the film of navigating the complex biblical themes regarding race, like the curse of Ham, by simply erasing people of color from the narrative entirely. And Anthea Butler from the University of Pennsylvania argued that casting only white actors in the roles of the sole survivors of humanity sends a deeply troubling, even if unintentional, message about who is deemed worthy of salvation.
Those are profound critiques regarding historical erasure and the implicit biases in casting massive studio tentpoles.
So how did the creative team respond? Because when you are handling a $160 million property, you have to answer for those casting decisions.
The defense was articulated primarily by the film's co-writer, Ari Handel. And his justification hinged on the specific genre they believed they were operating within.
Okay.
He argued that from the inception of the project, they realized they were not making a historical documentary, they were operating at the level of myth.
I really want to dissect that defense because the argument is essentially, because this is a universal mythic story about the human condition, the literal ethnic accuracy of the actors doesn't apply.
That is exactly the core of his argument. He posited that in a mythical framework, the characters act as stand-ins for all of humanity, and therefore their specific racial background is superseded by the universal themes they represent.
But does that defense actually hold up against the criticism? Because if the story is truly universal, representing all of humanity, wouldn't that be the perfect argument for casting a highly diverse ensemble rather than an exclusively white one?
That's the counter-argument, yes.
Because by using the myth defense to justify a homogeneous cast, it almost implies that whiteness is the default setting for universal humanity, which seems to just validate the exact critique Anthea Butler was making. It leaves the audience to weigh whether the genre of mythology is a valid artistic shield or just a convenient excuse for entrenched casting habits.
It is a complex debate that really reveals how deeply intertwined ancient narratives are with modern social dynamics, And it underscores the sheer cultural weight of the name.
It really does. It is wild to consider that a single narrative about a man building a boat can simultaneously spark debates about CGI rendering limits, ancient Enochian angelology, international Islamic censorship laws, and modern racial representation in media.
It's a lot for one name to carry.
It is. But as we pivot to our final source, we encounter an incredible irony regarding that Islamic censorship we just talked about. Because, as we just discussed, Indonesia banned the 2014 film over the visual depiction of a prophet. Yet, in that exact same country, which is the largest Muslim-majority nation in the world, one of the most famous secular pop rock bands to ever exist is named Noah.
The irony is striking, but the story of how that band acquired the name offers a brilliant, unexpected case study in what the concept of Noah represents when it's stripped of its strict religious dogma and applied to the mechanics of public relations.
Let's map out the trajectory of this band because their story has all the dramatic beats of a disaster movie. Before they were Noah, they were known as Peter Pan. They formed in the early 2000s playing cafes in Indonesia, and they quickly skyrocketed to a level of fame that is really hard to overstate. To give you a sense of the scale, their 2004 album, Bintang di Surga, sold over 3 million copies.
Wow.
Yeah. They were dominating the Indonesian music industry, winning MTV Asia Awards, and touring relentlessly.
They were the absolute apex predators of their specific cultural ecosystem.
They were untouchable. But then, the structural integrity of the band began to collapse. In 2006, they suffered a major internal fracture, losing their keyboardist and their bassist due to creative differences.
That's tough.
It is. They managed to survive that and keep playing, but they knew they were going to have to change their name eventually due to trademark issues with the departing members. But before they could execute a planned rebrand, the real catastrophe hit in 2010.
The deluge.
Exactly. The deluge. Their lead singer, Ariel, became embroiled in a massive, highly publicized scandal that resulted in his arrest and imprisonment. And the momentum of the band completely stopped. They were paralyzed.
I can imagine.
They couldn't tour, they couldn't release the new music they had been working on, and the public narrative surrounding them was entirely toxic. Their career was essentially underwater.
From a public relations standpoint, they were facing total annihilation.
The brand
Was irrevocably tainted by the scandal.
But they don't fold. They wait it out. In 2012, Ariel is released, and the band realizes they can't just pick up where they left off. They need a complete narrative reset. They need a vehicle to navigate out of the wreckage of their previous identity, and that is when they announce their new name. They rebrand officially as Noah.
And the mechanism of that rebranding is brilliant. They didn't just change the logo, they adopted a concept that inherently communicates survival.
And it works flawlessly. They release a comeback album under the new name called Seperti Seharusnya, and it is a massive success. It sells over 1 million copies. They win multiple AMI awards, which are essentially the Indonesian Grammys, and they completely reclaim their position in the industry.
Incredibly.
They navigate a literal flood of public scandal, internal fracture, and legal trouble, and they use the name Noah as the exact vehicle for their survival.
It perfectly illustrates how the conceptual weight of the name transcends language, geography, and specific theological doctrines. In this context, it isn't about ancient covenants or legal precedents. It becomes a universal, instantly recognizable shorthand for starting over.
It is so explicit that in 2015, they release an album consisting of re-recorded versions of their old Peter Pan hits, and they bring in Steve Lillywhite to produce it, the guy who produced U2 and the Rolling Stones, bringing this massive international gravitas to the project. And what do they title this album?
Second Chance.
Second Chance. They lean entirely into the metaphor.
It is the ultimate distillation of the Noah archetype, enduring the destruction of the old world to build a new one.
So when we step back and look at this massive eclectic map we've drawn today, what does it all mean for the listener? Why should we care about this chaotic collection of sources? I think it proves the immense, almost gravitational power that a single cultural concept can exert across time.
Right.
We are looking at one specific name that has the durability to dictate modern American baby registries, the legal weight to anchor ancient battles for women's property rights, the theological depth to frame a modern, covert spiritual identity for non-Jews in Texas, the cultural friction to trigger a $160 million Hollywood clash over race and religion, and the symbolic clarity to serve as the ultimate public relations lifeboat for a fractured rock band.
When you synthesize all of these disparate narratives, a very clear universal architecture emerges. Whether we are analyzing the daughters of Zelophehad demanding their rightful land in a harsh desert, Jim Long seeking a universal moral baseline in modern society, Darren Aronofsky exploring the tension between environmental rage and human mercy on a cinematic canvas, or an Indonesian band surviving the absolute collapse of their public reputation. Noah is, at its core, a manual for navigating the apocalypse.
It is the ultimate blueprint for the day after the disaster.
Precisely. It is about the mechanics of what happens when the world as you understand it is fundamentally destroyed, whether that destruction comes in the form of a literal planetary flood, an oppressive ancient legal system that seeks to erase you, a profound crisis of faith and identity, or the catastrophic ruin of your life's work.
Yeah.
The concept of Noah provides the framework for survival.
And viewing it through that lens brings up a really provocative final thought. If we look back at Aronofsky's 2014 film, there's a moment during the climax that completely deviates from the traditional narrative, but it hits at the very core of this idea. Noah is standing on the ark, the old world is dead, and he is standing over his newborn twin granddaughters.
Right.
He's holding a weapon, fully intending to kill them because he believes the Creator's justice demands the absolute end of the human race. The burden of human corruption is just too heavy, but in that final, critical moment, he doesn't strike.
He chooses differently.
He drops the weapon. He is overwhelmed by a profound, inexplicable sense of love and mercy. He chooses to let humanity continue, not because they deserve it, but because he chooses mercy over absolute judgment. And when you look at all the wildly different sources we've unpacked today, from legal battles to spiritual awakenings to public redemption, it makes you reconsider what this name actually represents.
It really does.
Perhaps the true enduring legacy of the name Noah isn't really about the floodwaters. It isn't about the wrath of a deity or the structural engineering of the boat itself. Maybe ultimately the name asks us a much quieter, much more difficult question.
What's that?
When the floodwaters of our own lives finally recede, whether that deluge was an ancient systemic injustice, a profound and isolating spiritual crisis, or a very public, devastating failure, do we have the mercy and the courage required to actually step out of the ark and rebuild?